So God willing, this is going to be our first attempt at a live tour. It's very exciting. And I spent many years standing below where Ken is standing right now, actually where I'm sitting this picture, teaching the kinds of things I've been teaching on Wednesdays to you people. And this was my view. It was kind of a nice view to sit there and learn with people and study. So I'm glad to be able to do it again. But you do want to see places in beautiful Israel. So we're going to have sessions on beautiful Israel and take you to different places in the country, particularly in the old city of Jerusalem. How many been to the old city of Jerusalem? Hands up.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
All right. How many have been to the old city of Jerusalem and heard Rabbi Ken Spiro explain them to you? Yeah, see? There's Ken. I have. And there's nothing like that. So it's a big privilege that we have Ken here. And when I sent out that invitation, you'll see since I sent it out, it's been populated with source sheets and charts. I'm going to be sharing some of the material that Ken would normally be holding up in front of the group that you are. So I will share my screen when those appropriate times come. And again, we have some verses that he'll be mentioning. I may read them. We may not get to them, but you'll have them. You'll have them with the replay at the end, okay? So any questions in the chat box? And otherwise, we're going to have a great time. Right now, it is coming on 7 p.m. in Jerusalem. Sunset is going to be about 7:50, 7:47, 6. So we'll still have light by the time he finishes. And it's going to be actually the time of the afternoon prayers are going to be going on down by the Western Wall. And here we go. So I'm going to hand it over to Ken. Let me see. I'm going to highlight you, Ken, just a second. Spotlight your video. And I'm going to...
There I am for all the Toronto people, including Rabbi Shmuel Veffer. I'm wearing my Toronto hat. It gets kind of windy up here, especially late in the day. So I heard someone from Toronto there. So what we're going to do is, actually, of course, it never fails that when I start to speak, someone starts playing drums. So I don't know why we're playing drums now, because it's not Bar Mitzvah Day at the Western Wall. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I hope the picture is good. I'm going to alternate between looking at me and then panning out to what we're looking at. I hope some of you joined me previously. We did some classes that were not live tours, but from my apartment in the old city. So now we're going to do a little live tour. This is actually the first proper live Zoom tour I've done since COVID-19 hit us all. So thank God things are back in action. What I want to do is focus primarily, we're going to go to a couple of places. We're going to start here. We're right now on the roof of the Asia Torah World Center. You can see it around me, which I highly recommend when things open up here and you can come back for a visit to the holy city, that you come up here, because as you'll see from the tour, it really is one of the great views in Israel and an ideal place to give an overview of the Temple Mount and of Jerusalem and the holy sites in the Western Wall. And then we're going to make our way down, hopefully, time and light permitting, to the wall itself and end our tour down below. But we're going to start up here. And I want to start by, first of all, I'm going to pan around. I'm going to switch my camera here and give everyone a view. We're looking to the south now. This is the Jewish quarter over here, looking to the west where the sun is starting to set. But looking to the south down here is where our story of Jerusalem is going to begin. We'll get to what's over here on the east later, which is the Temple Mount on the Western Wall. But if you look down this way, the original story of Jerusalem begins in an area, even though we're quite high up in the Jewish quarter, you can't see where our story really begins, the city of David. Before we get to the city of David, I want to talk a little bit about, let me go back to looking at my smiling face here, and we'll turn this way so you can see the beautiful scenery in back of me. I want to start talking about the whole Jewish connection to Jerusalem, which I did mention in a previous class that we did. We talked about how the only people who can claim to be more indigenous to the city than the Jewish people are not the Palestinians. That's a rather new connotation, but the Canaanite tribe that lived here, that existed in this area, because prior to the Jews coming to the land of Israel, the indigenous inhabitants of the land were Canaanites. And the Bible describes how there were 7 different Canaanite nations inhabiting 31 city-states. Jerusalem was one of those city-states, which, as I mentioned also when I previously talked about the names of the city and how many times it's mentioned, Jerusalem is not called Jerusalem in the 5 books of Moses. The people who lived here originally were called the Jebusites. And I'm going to go back to my camera facing out again. And what we're looking at down here is the southern part of Mount Moriah. Now, this the original city of Jerusalem. Today, if we pan around, we see Jerusalem, and we don't even see most of the city because we're low down towards the Temple Mount itself. But the modern city of the modern old city is significantly larger than the original city. The original city of Jerusalem actually begins at the lower part of a hill that you cannot even see from here. It's called Mount Moriah. And I always say what Mount Moriah lacks in physical size, it makes up for in spiritual greatness and intensity. We're going to get to that later. But the hill, it's really a hill, not a mountain, begins to the south, what we're looking at now. And actually, if you see that white dome structure, if you look to the left of the white dome and down into the valley, again, you cannot actually see it, although I see it's kind of reversed. I'm looking at my camera and realizing that everything is backwards.
No, it's not. It's fine. It's fine, Ken.
It's just how I see it. Oh, okay. Okay, that's how I'm seeing myself in the camera. Okay, so if you look to the left of the dome down below, that's the lower part of what is Mount Moriah. The original inhabitants, the Canaanites who lived here, the Jebusites, as they were called, lived down there because, there you can see, thank you. You can see this is the lower part of the hill because at the bottom of the spring, if you look on this image that Shmuel is showing us here, you can see a little piece of fortification jutting out. That corresponds to a spring tower that was built by the Canaanites in the Middle Bronze period 3,700 years ago. Because we know that the most valuable commodity in the world is not oil, it's not gold, it's not platinum, it's water. And since it doesn't rain here for half the year, it's very important to have a water supply, because without water, you're only around for about 3 days. And in the Middle East, when it's hot, that's even less time than that. So the Canaanites, the Jebusites, will build an ingenious fortification to protect the spring, but that will also explain why they built their little city at the lower part of the hill, because they needed to be near that water. So that's the image you're seeing here. You're seeing a reverse image now, which Shmuel is showing is a picture of the lower part of the city, both the Canaanite city and how it would look as an early Jewish city. But there you're looking from the south, looking north, exact opposite direction of what I'm facing, looking up. This is what we cannot see from where we're standing because it's just outside the city walls. The actual walls are blocking that view from us. But now we understand this is the city of Shalem, as it's called in the 5 books of Moses. And the first place it's mentioned in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 14. And this is where our narrative, our Jewish connection really first begins. When Abraham's nephew Lot is taken as part of the spoils of war, in a war that takes place 3,700 years ago. I call it World War I, the 4 kings against the 5 kings. Lot is taken prisoner. Abraham goes to rescue Lot, and after he wins the battle, he comes back to Jerusalem, and Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, will come and greet him, and it says he was a priest of God Most High. So I'm going to go back to looking at me now. Here we go. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Now we have the actual quote. So you can see Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, comes out to meet Abraham. But the question we want to ask is, why Jerusalem for the Jewish people? And the answer is, and I mentioned this previously, if you were partaking in the last class, we talked about how we Jews are not just a religion, we're also a nation. And we pick our spiritual political capital for primarily spiritual reasons. And if we go a little further into the book of Genesis, we'll be able to understand the Jewish connection to the city. So if we go back to looking at that site down below again, fast forward to Genesis chapter 22. Abraham at that time is living way south of here. He's living near Beersheba, which is the Negev desert of today. And God says to him, he says, and it happened after that thing that God tests Abraham. And he says, Abraham, and I'm just paraphrasing, you could read along as I'm sort of paraphrasing the quote. He says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and off from upon one of the mountains that I will tell you. And it says that Abraham wakes up early in the morning and he saddles his donkey and he travels for 3 days. Today it's an hour, hour and a half by bus or car or taxi. On the third day, he saw the place from afar. And if we can go back to the actual, just camera image, if you look off on the horizon, you'll see a hill. That today is the south of the old city of today. Today, that neighborhood is called Talpiot or Amona Natsiv, which means the palace of the governor. If you actually look, you can see, I don't know, hopefully it's clear, you'll see two antennas there sticking out on the top of there's some trees at the top. There's a white building with a flag, and there's two antennas. That is the actual original British governor's mansion. That's where it gets its name from. But that's a relatively new building from the beginning of the 20th century. But originally, that is probably the place where Abraham will first see the city of Jerusalem from, because if you're traveling from the south on what is the spine, the mountain ridge that runs up the center of the country, which is called Derech Avot, the way of the patriarchs. That is a mountain ridge road that travels south from the Negev desert through Hebron, the city of the patriarchs, the first Jewish-owned real estate in the land of Israel, bought by Abraham 3,700 years ago as a burial place for his wife Sarah, and where all the patriarchs and matriarchs, except for Rachel, are buried. Abraham will travel up that road. That is the natural travel road to make it to Shalem, to make it to Jerusalem. But you can't see Jerusalem, the old city, from the road. But if you take a little detour off to the right, to the east, which is what the hill you're looking at is, this is what you'd be able to see. You'd be able to see that picture that you saw previously of that Canaanite city at the lower part of the hill with the little fortification protecting the spring. The Bible does not describe, the book of Genesis does not describe what Abraham sees in terms of the city, whether there was any people there or not, but it's logical to assume that there were inhabitants at the lower part of the city. But that's not where our story takes place. What Abraham then does is he leaves his servants behind and Ishmael behind, and he takes the wood and he takes Isaac, his son, and he goes to the upper part of the hill. Now you're probably asking, where's the hill? There is no hill here that's visible today because thousands of years of construction, destruction, and reconstruction have literally obfuscated, have covered the whole hill, but it runs from the south, and as I pan, we're panning up about 600 meters, 600 yards or so. Actually, well, if you go back to the camera, I'll talk about that image in just a second. We're not quite ready for that. Oh, that's good to show, actually. You should go back to that for 1 second. It's good to explain. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm driving you nuts. You're being a very good technical assistant. Yeah, if you look at what is the western wall, which is below us in the plaza, you see a wall, and I'll explain more about that later when we get to the Second Temple period. But if we could remove that wall, you'd see Mount Moriah hidden behind it, as I've illustrated in my brilliantly drawn diagram that I drew to illustrate what we're looking at. The gold dome of today stands where the temple is in the illustration. But if we go back to the actual camera image now and make that the full screen, you'll see that underneath the gold dome is the highest part of the hill. Now you notice, first of all, in terms of the position of Mount Moriah, it is not the tallest mountain or hill around. The hills of the Mount of Olives, which are the peaks you see behind, you can see the 3 peaks of the Mount of Olives I'm panning here, are all taller. They're at about over 800 meters above sea level, and they are standing higher than the Temple Mount itself. And if we look this way, we'll also see that where we're standing, and in back of me, which is going to the west where the sun is setting, all of that hill, which is called the upper hill, the upper city, the Jewish border area, is also higher. So in the Psalms, in Tehillim, in the Psalms, it says that Jerusalem, the mountains surround you. Now you understand literally that's exactly what we're talking about, that the mountains surround Mount Moriah itself, but the upper part of the hill, underneath the gold dome, Jewish tradition states that that's the place where the binding of Isaac's story took place. And people always want to ask me, why did Abraham pick that spot? And I always give the same answer. I said, Abraham didn't pick the spot. God picked the spot. And then they ask me, okay, why did God pick the spot? And I said, you have to ask God. But in metaphysical consciousness, we understand that this is the nexus. This is the meeting place between the physical and the metaphysical. This is, we always say that, to speak to God when you're living in America, it's an operator assistance, long distance phone call. When you're in the land of Israel, it's a local call. But when you're right here where we are, or on the Temple Mount, even better, you just open your mouth. The connection is immediate. All the bars on your spiritual smartphone light up because the reception is super high. So this is the spot. So it's not that Abraham's, the binding of Isaac's story made the spot holy. It's the spot is intrinsically holy, and therefore it's the spot that famous story takes place on. So again, but during this period of time, there is no Jewish people. There's only Abraham and his immediate family. The Canaanites are occupying the city. Abraham is a stranger in a strange land. If we fast forward through the narrative, if I can go back to, if we fast forward through the narrative, and I'll put the beautiful scenery in the background, the light's better this way anyway, we know that Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob has his wives, they have 12 sons. We go through the Joseph narrative. Joseph goes down to Egypt. Eventually the entire family follows, 70 souls. At the end of the book of Genesis will end up in Egypt. And then we have that period of when we go from being a family to a nation. We have an initial period of freedom and then a period of slavery, in total a 210-year period in Egypt. And in the end, we have that Exodus narrative. And in that story, we know that we have the Passover story. God takes us out of Egypt. The Jewish people leave Egypt. We go to Mount Sinai. We get the Torah. We were supposed to immediately enter the land of Israel with Moses leading us, conquer the land of Israel, conquer Jerusalem, build the temple, and live happily ever after. But because of that story of the spies, when we badmouth the land of Israel, we have to wander in the desert for 40 years. Okay, some people think it's because none of the men would ask for directions, but the real reason is because we badmouth the land of Israel. We wander in the desert for 40 years. And we know, by the way, that when after Mount Sinai, God tells the Jewish people, he says, Vasuli miftash v'shochanti b'tocham, make for me a dwelling place, and I will dwell amongst you. And we build what is a prefabricated structure, which has a courtyard around it, and then a building built in the middle, which has two rooms. The outer room was called the Holy, the inner room was called the Holy of Holies, and also a giant altar for animal sacrifices. That was a prefabricated structure called the Mishkan, or in English, the tabernacle. And for 40 years in the desert, that building will be schlepped to 42 different locations, camps, different encampments as we wander in the desert for those 42 years. Meanwhile, during that period of time, the Canaanites are occupying the land of Israel, 7 Canaanite nations in 31 city-states. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we know what happens. Moses dies, Joshua takes over. We cross the Jordan River, which is actually in back over the Mount of Olives. We drop down on the other side of the hill over there is the Judean desert. We go from, it's very cool topographically, we go from 800 meters above sea level to the lowest spot on the planet Earth, the Dead Sea, which is more than 400 meters, the surface of the Dead Sea below sea level, because running in back of me from the north to the south is the Jordan Valley, the Syrian-African Rift Valley, which is Israel's today international eastern border. But that's also the place, the other side of which you can't see now. It's not there. Actually, you can I'll switch my view around. If we look off in the distance, in the haze, through the haze, if you can look clearly, you can actually see the other side of the valley, which is about 40 plus miles away. Today, that is Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, established in 1947. But back in the biblical period, that's the Kingdom of Moab. The Moabites are from there. So it's down in that valley, a little bit behind over here, exactly down below, going about 3,600 feet lower than we are standing. That's the distance you descend. That is where Joshua, who takes over leadership of the Jewish people after Moses' death, will lead the Jewish people across the Jordan River, and then we're going to have 7 years conquering and 7 years of settling the land. And during that time, although the book of Joshua will describe the Jewish people attacking and burning Jerusalem, it's clear that Jerusalem, which contained the most significant fortifications of any one of these 31 city-states, was not conquered by the Jewish people and will remain a non-Jewish city in the heart of a Jewish country. Down below where I am and back of me over there, at the lower part of Mount Moriah, will be this non-Jewish city in the heart of a Jewish country for 440 years. Now, after that 7 years of conquest and 7 years of settling the land will be divided up by tribes into, Jacob had 12 sons, more or less. Jerusalem will remain this non-Jewish city in the heart of a Jewish country, but tribally it will be divided between, to the south, down over here, this will be Judah, the whole southern part of the country. Down over here is Judah. To the north, panning up this way, everything up here will be Benjamin. And the dividing line is literally running through the buildings you're seeing north of the plaza here. Right by where the gold dome is the dividing line between those two tribes of Judah in the south and Benjamin in the north. So we fast forward after 440 years, which includes the period of Joshua and the period of Judges, when we have all these different judges who rule, the last of which is Samuel. The Jewish people will ask for a king. King Saul will be appointed king of the Jewish people. He will reign for a brief period of time. Following after Saul will come King David. And David will basically say, and he initially will rule 6.5 years. He will rule as king of the tribe of Judah. But then after 6.5 years, the Jewish people will come and say, be king over all of us. Once David becomes king of the entire Jewish people, he'll say, now that we have a king from whom all future kings will come, we now finally need a capital city, a unified capital for all 12 tribes. Now, until that time, the tabernacle, which had crossed with the Jewish people during Joshua's tenure as leader of the Jewish people, had been in 4 different locations. First, it was down in Gilgal. Then it was in Shiloh for 369 years. Then it was in Nov. And finally, it was in Givon. King David will say, now we need a capital city. He will send his general, Yoav ben Suriah. And Yoav, and you can go back, Shmuel, you can see described in the book of Samuel, it describes how the Canaanite inhabitants are taunting the Jews, meaning our fortifications are so significant that even a lame and the blind can keep you guys out of the city. But David uses some subterfuge, and he sends his general Yoav ben Suriah through the Tzinor, which is probably, we're not sure exactly, but probably part of that water system built by the Canaanites to both bring to connect the spring to the city walls, and also to irrigate the field. So Yoav ben Suriah will sneak into the city. He will open the gates of the city. King David will conquer the city, and David will build his city. And you go to Shmuel, you can show them that image now of the city of David. He will build his city over the original Canaanite city. Now, until that point, we see that everything below us is still outside the walls, the northern boundary of the city of Jerusalem. And now, once we get to the book of Joshua, we do call it Jerusalem. It's no longer called Shalem. That northern boundary of the city will be, if we can go back to the full camera view, if you see the wall, by the way, in the image there, on the right side of the picture, the northern wall of the city, at the top of the city, that's exactly what you're pointing out. If you go back to the camera view now, more or less is corresponding to what's south of the walls you see here today. You can see the city walls here. These are, by the way, the Ottoman Turkish walls. These are the new walls of the old city, completed in 1540. But even the northernmost part of the city did not encompass this area. What happens next is King David will then purchase the upper part of the hill, which is also described in the Bible, in the book of Samuel, which includes this area here from Aravna the Jebusite. And that's on the source sheet that you were sent. We're the only people who conquer and buy stuff. It's amazing. We wanted to show that we didn't take it by force. So Abraham pays a hefty sum, David pays a hefty sum to purchase the upper part of the hill, which is everything you're seeing from here to here, as the site where the temple will be built, which is the temple is just the final version made of solid stone with a proper roof. In Gilgal, in Shiloh, where the tabernacle was for 369 years, it was a stone building, but it had a cloth roof, fabric roof. But David will purchase that area. He wants to build the temple. He will rebuild his city and his palace over the Canaanite city, but he's told by God through prophet, no, it's not for you to build the temple. It's an interesting discussion we're not going to go into right now, but he gets the building plans together and lays everything out. What David will do is he will bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and he will dance wildly before the Ark. It's a great story also described in the book of Samuel. David's wife, Michal, will mock him for dancing so wildly, and David said, I would dance even wilder if I could. And Michal, for mocking David, her husband, the king, actually does not have any children as punishment for that. But the building of the temple is going to be left to David's son Solomon. David will unite the Jewish people, rule as king, conquer Jerusalem, build his city, build his palace, conquer all the surrounding enemies that threaten the Jewish state, and leave his son Solomon, when he dies at age 70, leave his son Solomon with a strong, united kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital. Solomon will be the person who will actually merit to build what is called the first temple. And that first temple will be the massive national building project of the Jewish people. Like just as the pyramids were for the national building project of ancient Egypt, is tombs for the pharaohs who had to enter the afterlife in grand style. Otherwise, it would negatively impact all of Egypt. So too, we will embark on a national building project, which will also involve the surrounding nations, the people up north in what is today Lebanon. Building materials will be sent down. The cedars of Lebanon will be used. This is a major piece of construction. And after several years of taxing and even drafting the Jewish people into coming to work in corvées, like levies of doing your stint, rebuilding the temple, that first temple will finally be completed. And if you can see also in the Bible, it describes the construction in tremendous detail, all the work that Solomon puts into building. And the crowning achievement is finally taking the ark, which his father David had brought to Jerusalem, and placing the ark in the Holy of Holies. If you want, you can look on your source sheets and you can actually see the description of that. This is really the zenith of Jewish history. We now have a king, descendant of King David, unified monarchy, 40 years of peace and prosperity. All the nations of the world are coming to learn from King Solomon. He's marrying all the daughters of all the kings to cement political alliances in an attempt to sort of jumpstart the redemption. But this is the zenith. It doesn't get better than this. Unfortunately, we know that this is not going to last, because after King Solomon's death, the kingdom will split into a northern kingdom of Israel with a king who is not a descendant of King Solomon, whose name will be Yerovam ben Nevat, and King Solomon's son Rehoboam will rule a smaller kingdom called Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as its capital. But that second temple building will stand for 410 years. Unfortunately, the northern kingdom will go into spiritual and moral decline. It will be destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, and those 10 tribes will be taken away into captivity. Those are the 10 lost tribes. The southern kingdom, with 20 different kings, all descended from King David as their kings, with Jerusalem as its capital, with the temple, will survive for more than a century longer. But it too will slide into spiritual and moral decline. And eventually, the next great world power, the Babylonians, will eventually besiege, destroy Jerusalem, and send the Jews into exile for 70 years, where the story of Purim takes place. After 70 years, Allah, the prophecy of Jeremiah, the Jewish people will return and reestablish a small city, which will be back in the lower area, down below, back where we started out, down below here, built exactly over. If we take a tour of the city of David, and hopefully we'll go down there and on a later tour, I can show you the remains of the earliest Second Temple period walls, because the number of returnees was initially quite small, so a large city wasn't needed. A small temple will be constructed over the ruins of the destroyed first temple. But as Jerusalem is reestablished and the temple is rebuilt, just like with the reestablishment of the Jewish state in 1948, only a tiny percentage of Jews will be living in Israel, a small percentage, maybe 5% of the world's Jewish population will live here. But as the state expands and things settle down, the population will grow, so too. And then we get to what is something I want to show you now, which is the Second Temple period, part 2. Now we know we'll go from the Persian Empire to the Greeks to the Hanukkah story, and then in 63 BCE, the Romans will arrive, Pompey Magnus, and absorb Israel into the Roman Empire known as the Roman province of Judea. It is during this period of time, in the last few decades before the Common Era, that Herod the Great will become king of Israel. He's not a descendant of King David. He was appointed by Augustus Caesar. He wasn't legitimate to be king of Israel. And Herod is one of the great builders. He was quite a cruel and oppressive person, but he was a tremendous builder. He built some of the most monumentally impressive structures in the land of Israel. Masada, Caesarea Maritima, the artificial port city. And to ingratiate himself with his people who hated him, he will spend a massive amount of money expanding the upper part of that hill, that holy rock, and completely not remodeling, but from the bottom up, rebuilding the temple into, and I'm showing you right now, this is a model that stands on the roof of the Aish Torah building. This is the largest detailed model. Unfortunately, it's not in the best state. There's some things lying in there that don't belong there, but this is the largest detailed scale model of Herod's second temple, which will stand for a period of about over 80 years from the reign of Herod the Great until it's destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE. When Herod dies, several of his descendants will rule as rulers in Israel. The Romans will go back to direct rule of the country. They will eventually, the Jewish people in the year 67 of the Common Era will rebel against the Romans. The Romans will crush that revolt. It's called the Great Revolt from 67 to 70. And in the year 70, the Romans will conquer Jerusalem, basically crushing the revolt. They will level the city as punishment, destroying the temple, and leaving only a few of the largest structures still standing or partially standing as sort of a testament to the might of Rome and the consequences of rebelling against the Roman Empire. What we're seeing now, and we're going to go down now and show you a close-up view, and then we're going to head down from here all together to the plaza as the sun is now.
Should I show them the big picture of Herod's temple?
Let me show you. Let's show. Let's actually, yeah. If we were, let me just hold on one second, Shmuel. Let me just show you now for 1 second. This is the view, again, looking at the Temple Mount of what we see today. Here you have the Western Wall, and you can see the Gold Dome and the Temple Mount. But if you're standing on this spot 2,000 years ago, prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, now please, Shmuel, if you could show them the image. This is what you would see. Now you can see here, and Shmuel can point it out with the cursor there. You can see that the orange area in this image, that is the Western Wall. See, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the Western Wall it is. It's not a piece of the temple. It is merely a piece of retaining wall. If you move to the right, which is to the south, to the southwest, the southern corner there, okay, and then you go up to the north. This is the entire length of the retaining wall, of which the vast majority is hidden behind the houses in the Muslim quarter today. So the Western Wall is just a small piece of that retaining wall. So if you can just go back to the image, the cutaway view, that my hand-drawn picture, now we can explain exactly what people are looking at. There it is. Okay, we got it. Okay, there, you see. Now it's today. This is a cutaway image looking south. If we're standing south of the Temple Mount looking north, where the temple is today is where the gold dome is in our image you can see in the small frame on the side of your screen. Okay, but what the Western Wall is, when I say retaining wall, how do you build a platform on top of a mountain? You build walls like a giant, in this case, it's a trapezoid. It's not a square, it's not a rectangle, it's a trapezoid. You build 4 walls around the upper part of the hill. Then you can put a bunch of supporting arches, lay down a floor on top of it, and on that floor, leaving a small area where there's an exposed piece of bedrock. That's the site of the Binding of Isaac story. On top of that, you can build the temple itself. Okay, so the Western Wall, if you look to the left in the picture, you'll see today when you stand at the Western Wall, you can see that dotted line, you're standing there. But the wall itself extended much higher up. And that Western Wall, you can see I've actually outlined there. I've sort of highlighted a little piece of it there. When the Romans will destroy Jerusalem, they will push everything from the floor of the platform into the valley below. So you can see the floor, right. And therefore, when you stand at the western wall, we'll see this when we go down to the plaza itself, only the 7 layers you see today which are at street level, are the original 7 layers of Herodian stone. Everything else was reconstructed. The upper part was reconstructed by the Muslims when they conquered the city of Jerusalem in the 7th century. They will reconstruct the upper part of the wall so people won't fall off the platform, and then they will add that gold dome that you're seeing today, which we talked about previously in the previous class, but that gold dome was only finished in the year 691 as an Islamic holy site. It's the earliest great Islamic holy site in the world. It predates the Great Mosque in Mecca. And Islamic tradition, which I don't want to go into the whole story now, but it links it to a story in the Quran, chapter 17 of the Quran, as the site where Muhammad, even though in the Quran Jerusalem is not mentioned anywhere, the site where Muhammad took his midnight ride on his flying horse, al-Burak. So for Sunni Muslims, that gold dome of today is their 3rd holiest site, and for the Jews, it's our one and only holiest site in the world.
Okay.
But again, underneath that gold dome, exposed piece of bedrock, which is why it's called the Dome of the Rock, because that stands exactly over the site where, in Jewish tradition, according to the vast majority of opinions, since we don't have much, we have little or no remnant of the actual temple, and whatever was left that survived the Roman destruction has been largely, by the way, often deliberately destroyed by Muslims on the Temple Mount over the last many decades. So we can't say exactly where the temple stood, but the vast majority of opinions hold that it makes a lot of sense. Underneath the gold dome and where that exposed bedrock is would be the site of the Holy of Holies. So again, going back to the what you see today now, the plaza, the western wall is just, Shmuel, if you could go back to the image, the drawing of this perspective of the Temple Mount, Lynn Rittmeyer's drawing. No, scroll down. There we go. Okay. So now we understand the western wall is a piece of that retaining wall. That retaining wall goes off to the right. And let's go back to the camera. Make it the main image. Okay, there's the southern part of the retaining wall. That's the southwest corner. And it continues up. Notice to the north of the temple, to the north of the western wall, it disappears behind all these Arab houses, because going back 1,000 years ago, during the early Islamic period, they filled in. Below us is a deep valley. You can even see, looking down here, this is the western wall, the new building of the Western Wall Heritage Foundation. If you look at what I'm pointing at now, there's a street here, a modern street, and you can see a cliff. This is the Tyropian Valley that's running from the Damascus Gates underneath the Western Wall Plaza all the way down. It was the western boundary of the city of David historically. Today it is completely buried under rubble, but you can actually see part of that cliff, and underneath where they're building this new building for the Western Wall Heritage Foundation, you can even see some of the archaeological remains that are much, much older than the building, thousands of years old. There's even some First Temple period stuff. But this Tyropian Valley goes up to the north, and this is the valley that separates the upper city here from the Temple Mount itself. This whole area here is where the valley was filled in by a series of arches, on top of which were built buildings, and those buildings today are built up against the vast majority of the Western Wall, and therefore you cannot see the Western Wall anymore. It's hidden behind all of these buildings. But some of the Arab houses here actually have the parts of the Western Wall as their living room wall. It's amazing. But if you want to see the entire length, look at the minarets. Now, the minarets are, if you look at with the camera, you'll see there's a tree here, and there's the black dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, right to the right of the black dome, you see a minaret. A minaret is a prayer tower on a mosque. Used to be people, the muazzin would stand up there and yell so people could hear him, which is why they built the towers. There's one. This is the southern part. If we go over here, you see to the left of the gold dome, there's a second minaret. Okay, that's about less than a third of the way up this western wall. Now, if we pan all the way to the north, you can see up there, there's a little tree, and there's a third minaret. If you can look there on the screen, you'll see it. That is 500 meters long, over 500 yards long this way. That is the entire length of that retaining wall the longest of the walls, which was the western boundary of the Temple Mount, which, by the way, we now know was completed. Herod did not complete this in his lifetime. I don't want to go into all the details now. We'll save that for when we do a tour of these southern excavations, possibly. But this wall was built over many decades. The platform was expanded. It was a massive construction project. So here you can see the entire length of that wall, going from where we're looking now to the east, to the Mount of Olives, which is what you're seeing, the hills on the horizon there. In back of the Gold Dome are the three peaks of the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives are the eastern bordering mountain range on the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem. Very important in Jewish and Christian writings, by the way. But there's a wall, a southern wall, that's extending from where you're looking now, going to the east, that goes 300 yards long, and then the wall continues again another almost 500 yards past the Gold Dome, and then those two, the western and eastern walls, are connected by a northern wall, which was the northern wall of the Temple Mount, which is largely destroyed at the time of the Roman crushing of the Jewish revolt. But today, the important thing to understand is the entire western wall, the entire southern wall, and the entire eastern wall are all visible. If you go to the southern excavations, which we'll hopefully do later, you can see the entire southern wall. And if you go to the Mount of Olives, up over there, where you can see the Seven Arches Hotel on top over there, and what you're seeing there are the white stone, are the gravestones of the Mount of Olives Cemetery, which is the world's oldest continually used cemetery. There's up to 150,000 Jews buried there over the last several thousand years. But on the top is a hotel and a beautiful vantage point. If you look back towards where I'm standing, if you look from the east towards the west, you can see the entire eastern face of the retaining walls of the Temple Mount. And if we look down here, I want to point out one more thing. There is some scaffolding over here. If you see where the ramp is the Mugrabi Gate. This is the only gate where it's actually a ramp going to a gate which you cannot see. This is the only gate for tourists, non-Muslims. There's 7 other gates that Muslims can access to the Temple Mount. But if we look to the right, to the south, you can see some scaffolding. That's some repair work being done. And if you look above the scaffolding, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's you can see the stone sticking out of the wall, which is the beginning of an arch. Well, if you just go back for a minute to the drawing of Lynn Rittmeyer's drawing, if you can go back to that. We go up to the, yeah, there it is. Exactly. That is, if you can see, that is the remains of Robinson's Arch. Robinson's Arch is not, Robinson was not a guy in the Bible. Robinson was an American Bible scholar from the mid-19th century. He discovered the remains of a massive stairway. This is one of the largest stone arches in any piece of construction in the Roman Empire. That was an entrance that brought people from the valley street that ran below the Temple Mount, which is still very much there today, into a 300-meter long large public building called the Royal Stoa, which had 162 columns in it. Each was so large it took 3 men with their arms linked to get their arms around the columns. That building is completely gone today, as is all the upper part of the Temple Mount above the platform itself. So the only thing we have left today that you can see of the remains of Herod's temple, there's no remains of the actual temple structure itself. You can see the lower part of the platform. You can see the remains of Robinson's Arch, and you can see the first 7 layers from what is street level today going up are the original Herodian stone, which are quite distinctive. But what I'm going to do now in the time we have left is I'm now going to, now we're going to have to go through, I'm going to walk down to the western wall. You're going to have to follow me now. Whoop. Off the roof of the Aish Torah building. We're going to head down and out. And in the few minutes we have left, we're going to visit the plaza, and I'm going to show you how you can identify what is original construction from the time of King Herod 2,000 years ago, late Second Temple period, to what was added on later by the Muslims. So we are exiting down the Aish Torah World Center building. I'm getting my step exercise today. I apologize for the, hope I don't lose you guys. I'm gonna have to exit the building. Okay. Okay. Okay, now I am.
Now you're in the Jewish quarter. It's a residential quarter, correct?
This is the Jewish quarter now. Yeah, but we're going to walk down this way, down the stairs. And I want to point out one more thing as we're going down here.
But those are private homes. Those are windows for
These are all
private
private
apartments.
homes. This is actually Esha Torah Yeshiva over here. You can see there's a lot of Arabs use this to get from the Arab village of Silwan to the Muslim quarter, so they walk up and down the stairway over here. But now we're heading down to the plaza itself. I want to point out one more thing, which is really cool, which a lot of people just walk by and don't even notice as they're walking by, which is what we have over here. Hidden in, I'm going to go back to, hidden in the bushes over here, right up by the stair that I came down, is a pipe. You can see, there it is, that pipe in there, if you see. This runs right into the Esha Torah building. This is part of the aqueduct system, because the spring that was originally used, the Gihon spring that we talked about earlier, did not supply enough water for the entire city, so they had to get alternative water supplies. And back then they used gravity and aqueducts, so the water would flow from the only place that's higher than Jerusalem is okay, wait, I gotta get my mask out here. Hold on. They're gonna make me put a mask on now, guys. So I'm gonna have to hold on. I'm gonna have to talk with my mask on. I apologize. They're very big into, sorry. 1 second. You get to experience COVID-19 precautions. Oh, this is so much fun. Talking with the mask on. So
Wait, the guy in the booth didn't have one on,
spring
right?
was not enough water, so they would bring water from the Ein Arub. Sorry?
The guy in the booth didn't have one on.
I know, he's telling me to put one on, but he didn't have one on. What can you say? He's not following his own advice. So the spring was not enough water, so they made a series of aqueducts that actually, the only place higher than Jerusalem is Hebron. It's over 900 meters up. So the spring water would be brought using gravity and through a series of, and here you can see the pipe, actually, the aqueduct, I'll show you here, runs in the side of the hill here, right through the Esha Torah building. Actually, I could take you in the building downstairs and you can actually see where the aqueduct is running through the building over there. But this is amazing because this aqueduct is traveling altogether. It's traveling a 56 miles from the Ein Arub spring south of Hebron and is dropping only 90 meters in 56 miles. And then it crossed over a bridge that ran right over here where you're seeing in the camera where the buildings are, a bridge aqueduct that brought the water into the Temple Mount itself. So that's like a little interesting piece of archaeology that's right here. But let me go back to, we have to go through security now and into the plaza. Okay. Hopefully they're not going to give me a hard time going through with
Tell him יש לך קבוצה. You have a group.
מה נשמע? אני עושה את הסיור זום.
שים אותו בצד, שים אותו בצד ואז תכנס.
Okay. They're making me leave my phone here. Hold on 1 second, guys. I apologize.
Bring your gun.
You got to have a real experience of going through security at the Western Wall with me. It was so much fun. Okay, so now we are in the plaza itself. Come on, this is real life. And you can see, by the way, because of COVID-19, they've made, besides making everyone wear masks, they also are divided up the plaza. Normally it's a large open space. Let me turn my camera around. I can show you this. Now you can see the H building in back of me. This is where we were before. You can appreciate how great the view is. Location, location, location. And let me here show you here. Now we're walking in the plaza itself. So we are standing suspended about 70 feet above the bottom of that valley, which is called the Tyropian Valley, which was the original western border of the city. The border on the other side of the mountain here between us and the Mount of Olives is called the Kidron Valley, or the Valley of Jehoshaphat. And today, because Jerusalem has expanded, there is a valley that runs to the west of us. Looks like a Hebrew letter Shin, which is this, which is the Gay Ben Hinnom, the Valley of Ben Hinnom. So today, Jerusalem sits with a valley bordering it to the west below the Jaffa Gate, a valley bordering it to the east. On the other side of what we're looking at now, the other side of the Temple Mount, between us and the Mount of Olives, and the valley that is right below our feet, which disappears, which is totally not visible anymore today because of the construction and deconstruction. By the way, until 1967, Six-Day War, this was a slummy Arab neighborhood built here called the Mughrabi Quarter. I actually have a picture that I'll be happy to share. I could share with you even of the Esha Torah building, what it looked like going back to 1910. In 1967, this whole area, the Arabs who lived here were moved out of here. This whole area was bulldozed by the Israeli government and turned into a large plaza. And that's the central prayer plaza for the Western Wall of today. Here you can see the ramp that the tourists can use to go up to the Mughrabi Gate, which of course is not open now and is the only gate open for tourists. If you look at the wall itself, however, and we're going to go down in there now, I'll show you. And I'm going to walk a little closer, then I'll walk up very close.
Here's the picture of what it looked like with the Mugrab Quarter, Ken.
Ah, you can tell. Excellent. Very good. There you can exactly see. There it is. Excellent. Now you understand. So a lot has been done here and is still being done here. By the way, you can hear how do you know it's sundown? The Arabs, this is perfect timing. You're going to hear the Muslim call to prayer. They pray 5 times a day, and they have numerous loudspeakers here. So in just a second, you're going to hear everywhere the Muslim call to prayer. Now, guys, here you see, remember, now we're experts. Now we understand what the Western Wall is. It's not a piece of the temple, it's a piece of retaining wall. We're standing, sort of hovering in the air above the Tyropian Valley. If we could remove the wall, we would see the hill of Mount Moriah buried behind that wall. In the time of the temple, over here would be that bridge aqueduct, which allowed people like the king to get from the temple back over into, let's say, the Jewish core, the rest of the old city, without having to walk all the way down in the valley and all the way back up again. And it also brought water into the Temple Mount on that aqueduct system, which was running, as you can follow, Mike, as we're panning around, underneath all these buildings, through the H building, and then traveling as far away, twisting and turning through the hills for 56 miles to the Ein Arub Springs. But if you look from here, what I want to do in the minute we have left, I want to go a little closer up here. And let me get to a place where we can, show you. Because to get down below is a little complicated. They don't let you just wander around like normal. They divide you up into groups. But if you look at the stones of the Western Wall, you can see that the first 7 layers, if you count from where the people are standing, count 7 layers of stone up. The first 7 layers of Herodian stone. How do you know the Herodian stone from what's been added later by the Muslims and afterwards? Herodian stone has a raised center and a recessed frame. It looks like it has a picture frame around it. Now, a lot of these stones, the facing, because of wear and tear and pressure, has fractured off of it, so they don't look so good anymore. But this is amazing construction because there's no cement used in the construction, in Herod's construction of the wall. It's called drywall construction, which means the only thing keeping this incredible wall up, this 500-meter long wall, this giant trapezoid, is the weight of the stones. How perfectly, thank you, very good, Shmuel, excellent job, exactly. It's the weight of the stones, how perfectly cut they are. You cannot fit a razor blade between the 2 stones. and how perfectly placed they are. And the average weight of these stones is 4 to 40 tons. If I could take you inside the Western Wall tunnel tour, which actually begins off to the left, underground over here, you would see there is a stone called there's a layer of stone called the Master Course, because it's a very significantly large stones. One of the stones in there is estimated 15 meters by 5 meters by 5 meters and weighs 585 tons. 585 ton stone. The stones you're seeing out here are small stones, 3-4 ton stones. So you have massive construction. You see there's some of the largest.
Here's the stone.
Yeah, there's a picture. Very good. You got everything. That's the stone. It's been somewhat chiseled away, and you can see the holes made in the stone where later this area was turned into a giant cistern. So they put a plaster coating on the outer part of the stones and filled it with water as an underground water storage facility. But it really is an amazing piece of construction. When this was finished, when the entire temple complex was finished, like I said, I mentioned in the previous class, we talked about the Jewish connection to Jerusalem. Even the rabbis who hated Herod, they still said, if you haven't seen the house of Herod, you haven't seen a house. And this was the largest functioning religious site on the planet Earth. So this is only a teeny taste, as impressive as the Western Wall itself is and how small the people are, contrast to the wall. At the time the temple stood, the wall went up significantly higher than the trees you're seeing over there. And from street level, by the way, street level of temple time is about 50, 60 feet below where people are standing today. That's all being excavated today. But if from street level to the top of the wall at the time of the temple was the equivalent of a 12-story building, about 120 feet up. On top, the temple, yeah, you can see exactly. On top, the temple was another 10 stories. It was about 40 feet higher than the top of the gold dome you see of today. So it's equivalent from the street level. By the way, street level is not bedrock. Bedrock is below that. But from street level to the top of the temple was 22 stories. That is one very significant piece of construction. And again, today, all we have left of that is just the Western Wall itself. Again, a small remnant of, and again, the holiest spot in the world. When you're praying, wherever we are as Jews, we pray towards Israel. In Israel, we pray towards Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, we're praying towards the Old City. In the Old City, we're praying towards here. But if I'm standing here and praying, I should actually just turn to the north a little and pray towards, you cannot see the gold dome here, but that is the direction of prayer. As it says in, in the words of the prophet, it says, my house is the house of prayer for all peoples. And Jerusalem is viewed as the conduit, just as Abraham recognized thousands of years ago that this was a natural place of conductivity and connection. So too, the Talmud says that because of the unique connection the temple has, and the spot has, Mount Moriah has, as the meeting spot between heaven and earth, that all prayers ascend from Jerusalem, from the spot to heaven above, and therefore it's the place where you want to pray, because your prayers will be heard, so to speak, more easily and more quickly from this spot than anywhere else. I think that's we're pretty much out of time. We got about 5 minutes left if anyone wants to ask any questions, Shmuel. I don't know. There's a beautiful quote from Isaiah that we included in the source sheet about how now we have just a remnant of the wall, but in the Messianic era, it says the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established, and upon the mountains shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will come to it and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And it talks about, and the nations of the world will gather here and beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And the reconstruction of the site as not just a spiritual site for the Jewish people, for all of humanity, as the site of connection, will be the ultimate sort of crowning achievement of Messianic era, when the whole world will hopefully live together in peace and brotherhood. And we should see that soon and in our days. And I don't know if anyone has any questions they want to ask me for a couple of minutes here. I'm happy to, as long as my battery lasts.
Okay, let's see your face. Turn it around.
Okay, let me turn my face around. Okay.
I had somebody ask earlier, what would happen, they're claiming, some archaeologists are claiming there might be another spot in the Mount Zion area or down below that might be the temple. If it was really proved, what would you do about that? How would that affect you personally?
Well, first of all, I mean, it doesn't really affect me personally because the temple, the only thing that's important is when even the Western Wall, like I said, is not an intrinsically holy site. It's a piece of retaining wall. Interesting thing in holiness is there's many places we're not necessarily sure they're the exact places. We can also imbue a place with holiness. The only issue would be halachically, in terms of Jewish law, would be to actually make sure that we reconstruct the temple itself on the correct spot, because that spot has that intrinsic holiness. The Holy of Holies would have to be on that correct place. And even though the vast majority of opinions archaeologically and historically hold that it is, up behind me over there, one thing is for sure: when the Messiah actually comes, Jewish tradition, he will have access to, he'll be able to go online, so to speak, with the big guy and confirm 100%
Right.
that it is accurate. But actually, halachically, in terms of Jewish law, we just need the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, which will be reestablished then. We don't need a sign from heaven to say that's the spot. We don't need like a beam of light to come down and point on it. X marks the spot. We would just need, practically speaking, the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, to come together and designate the spot where the temple is to be built, and also designate what will be considered to be the holy area of the entire Temple Mount platform itself. And once that's done, that's all we would need to actually reconstruct the temple.
Right. Well, there also is an idea that when the Jews, since a place becomes the place for the Jews to pray and connect to God, it establishes a holiness there that, because of that, there's not intrinsically, let's say, the Western Wall now.
Right.
It's been turned into a holy synagogue, as it were, because of the Jewish people have chosen to make it that. So another
Exactly.
question.
So practically speaking, it wouldn't change anything. And in terms of the reality of which, this is almost certainly the spot. Certainly.
Right.
All the archaeological evidence seems to point to it.
Right. So somebody else was asking about the other. Why is this one important and not the Eastern Wall? You have the Golden Gate and the Eastern Wall, but even the Southern Wall. The Southern Wall is where the Olei Regel came, where the pilgrims came and they entered. So that would have been traditionally a more important spot to pray from, rather than.
So first of all, it's a great question. That's a great question. People ask, Western Wall, why Western Wall? We have to appreciate that throughout Jewish history, when the temple was there, people would go to the temple. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, the temple in ruins. In the 2nd century, because the Jews had rebelled 3 times in 70 years, the Romans decided that's it. They plowed the Temple Mount under. They probably built a Roman temple to Jupiter on the spot, and they banned Jews from entering the city. The only time Jews would be allowed into the city would be the 9th of Av, which is the 9th of the month of Av, which is the day on which both the first and second temple were destroyed, on the same date in history, by the way. The Byzantines, the Romans, and later the Roman Christian Byzantine Empire would allow the Jews into the city, and they could even go up to the Temple Mount. The Pilgrim of Bordeaux in the 4th century describes the Jews would go up to the Temple Mount, circle it, tear their clothes, weep, read the Book of Lamentations, and then that's it. You're banned from the city again. So during the other 364 days a year, when Jews wanted to get as close as they could to the city, where they were banned from entering, they would go to places like the Mount of Olives. It's a famous story in the Talmud of Rabbi Akiva, visiting, looking down on the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives, and all the other rabbis weeping because they see the Temple Mount sitting in ruins. So it wasn't always the Western Wall. The Western Wall, now I don't know, Shmuel, if you have any images that you can access quickly, but again, the Western Wall was not this big plaza as we saw before. It was a narrow little alleyway, but it was the closest spot you could get to. Remember, you could go to the eastern side, where there's graffiti, by the way, carved into the southern side in Hebrew that's quite ancient. But think about it, if the real holy spot is behind me over there, where my finger's pointing, the gold dome, the closest spot you could get to the Holy of Holies, once Jews were allowed back in the city. I mean, if they were in the Byzantine, Crusader period, different periods of time, they were banned from the city altogether. But once they were allowed back into the city, which is during the Islamic period, they would want to go to the closest spot they could get. And remember, the Muslims banned Jews from going onto the Temple Mount, just as the Muslims banned for over 700 years, Jews, exactly, there you see a picture of it, exactly. This is what it looked like. This was about 8 feet higher than where we're standing today, the plaza of today. And it's a little narrow alley. There's no men's section, there's no women's section, there's nothing there. You can see all these images exactly. So the Muslims would not, the Muslims, unlike the Byzantines and many of the Crusaders, who wouldn't allow Jews in the city at all, the Muslims allowed us back into the city, but wouldn't allow us onto the Temple Mount. But we could, just like you could stand outside the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron and walk up 7 steps and come up against the wall and even look through a little crack and stare inside the building, but we were banned from going in. Jews would go to the closest place we could get to, the Holy of Holies. Remember, if we go a little bit to the north over here and walk another about 50, less than 100 yards, we're opposite the Holy of Holies, opposite the Gold Dome. So that was that one piece of exposed area. So that explains why Jews would go to here. So again, it's just a piece of retaining wall, but it's the closest we could get to the holy spot, which is below the Gold Dome itself, which was off limits. Today, you can go up to the Temple Mount. There's even, I know a guy who prays there. Well, of late they've had restrictions, but generally the Israeli authorities do not allow Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. Ironically, the only people allowed to pray on the holiest spot in the world for Jews are Muslims, even though it's under our control since 1967. The reason why the Israeli police don't allow it is because it gets the Muslims upset. It's kind of a weird concept. But you can go up and visit the sites. To go into the Gold Dome or the Black Dome, Jewish law prohibits you from going into the Gold Dome because it's the site of the Holy of Holies, which only the high priests could enter on Yom Kippur. But since 2000, I'm talking about 20 years ago, after the Second Intifada, Muslims will only allow Muslims into the Gold Dome site. But as a tourist, you can go in the morning up that ramp with go take your passport, and go and wander around on the site itself. So you can actually, as a Jew, even go up to the site itself. There's some discussion in Jewish law of where you can and cannot go. It's not a simple thing. There are restrictions, not just on everyone going up there, but only religious Jews tend to follow them today.
Okay, I'm going to give you one last question. I'm going to share with everybody. I'm going to try to answer your questions directly. You had a bunch more that haven't been answered. I want to ask you one more question. Victoria asked, where do you think the Ark of the Covenant is hidden? Is it hidden underneath the Dome of the Rock? What happened to the vessels? Where is
Excellent question. By the way, in the second temple, there's so much stuff we didn't get to, even though we spent a lot of time just talking about this site. The second temple, in the time of the first temple and the tabernacle before, which is going to be a 850-year period, the Ark was in the Holy of Holies. The Ark disappears before the destruction of the first temple. There's a discussion in the Talmud, which is of course written much later, where the Ark went. One opinion is that the Babylonians, when they destroyed the temple, took the Ark with them. I don't personally hold by that opinion. There's another opinion that the Ark, and there seems to be some stories in Jewish tradition that indicate that this is correct, that the Ark was hidden somewhere, very possibly under the Temple Mount somewhere, prior to the destruction. That means, by the way, practically speaking, that the Holy of Holies, which was only entered one day a year by one person, the high priest on Yom Kippur, was an empty room in the entire Second Temple period. There was no Ark. The high priest would go in and offer the incense in an empty room. But as to the location of the Ark, we do not know, but it could well be that somewhere underneath us in here, we're not allowed to dig. Under the Temple Mount, to dig is very politically complicated. We're digging all around, even below my feet now. There's digging going on and an incredible amount of excavations. But we say that in the Messianic era, when the Messiah comes, he will have his spiritual radar, ground-penetrating radar up, and he will be able to locate that wooden box gilded in gold in which was kept the tablets, both sets of tablets, the tablets smashed at the golden calf story, and the second set of tablets that Moses brings down the mountain when he comes down the second time.
All right.
So
that was
hopefully, Shmuel, hopefully we're going to have. We're doing one of your Zoom classes. The temple will be rebuilt before our eyes, and then we'll have.
Yeah, right.
That'll be quite a remote experience.
Okay, so listen, Ken, I want to thank you. That was really awesome. I want to thank everybody for being so patient. Listen, we want to do more and more of these. Here on the sign-up sheet, and I'm going to send you all the show notes with the verses. I'm going to add a few things that we talked about ad hoc that we weren't planning on. I'll try to add them in also, so you'll have them. On this, we have Ken's books. Click on them and buy them. That would be awesome. That would be amazing. Also, I think there's quite a few of you that are new. We have regular Zoom sessions that aren't open to the public. They're open to Galilee Green subscribers. And there's a special offer for you here also at the bottom of the show notes. If you enjoyed this one and you want to come to the rest of them, whether they're these or they're the study sessions with me, we're planning a cooking series as well. We have a special offer for you to get some olive oil twice a year. You can click here on the button and learn how to do that. A lot of you are here are already subscribers, and thank you for doing that, because without having done that, we wouldn't be able to be doing what we just did today. So thank you all for coming. Send in some more questions. You can email me about things you'd like to do in the future. I took a little poll at the beginning of the places you'd like to see next with Ken. I'll relaunch that right now. It's up in front of you. We have a few ideas of what we wanted to do, but you can click on it and decide where you'd like to go, the next top 2 or 3 places that you'd like Ken to cover. I'm going to be speaking with Ken to see if we can schedule it with him and have a fixed time to do this over the next little while, and have a regular series that you could sign up for. And other than that, I want to thank you all for coming. This was our biggest group yet, and wish you the rest of the week. Have a wonderful week, and we should all get rid of our masks and get rid of all of this plague and be able to get back to normal. So thank you all for coming, and blessings to you.
Amen.
Ken from Yerushalayim Yer Kodesh, and I'm up here, even though it looks like I'm in the old city, I'm up in the Galilee. All right, so everyone have a great day, and thanks for coming.
All right, thank you.